We are presented on the L'Aquila earthquake. Our chosen topic is a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in L'Aquila, Italy in 2009. It was a monstrous earthquake whereby 308 people were killed and many buildings damaged, leaving thousands of people homeless. A few years later, in 2012, the Vice Director of the Italian Department of Civil Protection and 6 scientists were put on trial, and all were condemned for manslaughter. They were sentenced to 6 years in prison. This was an unprecedented incident that instilled fear and uproar into the global scientific community. We chose this topic because it questions the responsibility of scientists and public bodies to effectively communicate with the public to better inform them of decisions concerning their safety. It brought to head the problem of modelling and communicating these complex prediction technologies to the public as they failed to do so. This led to great uncertainty within the Italian public, being told contradicting things in the media and by the government. Uncertainty is exacerbated in high-risk situations like this one.
The development of scientific models to map and predict disasters are undoubtedly useful, but will always involve a level of uncertainty. This is because they deal with increasingly complex issues such as earthquakes that are inherently unpredictable. The modelling used at L'Aquila detected ground motions through a broadband source model. 14 of their strong motion stations in place had detected activity over a 4-month period preceding the disaster. This type of model was inherently limited, however, as it was unable to identify high-frequency seismograms such as that at L'Aquila. There was also a large variability of the data recorded, as the ruptures followed a complex pattern of motion, which was unpredictable and random at the time of the earthquake. The increased complexity of the model and its variability, known as stochastic uncertainty, rendered it increasingly useless and difficult to predict, and reduced accuracy in the government's decision-making. Complexity in models also leads to increased inscrutability, confusing both politicians and the wider public on the topic. Scientific conclusions are therefore often oversimplified to allow for better accessibility. With straightforward data, politicians at L'Aquila were able to efficiently enforce a specific political agenda of social control, rather than social safety, to demonstrate their power over the earthquake. Brian Wynne, 2010, clarifies on how politicians remain overly dependent on integrating data into their policy, even though the science will always be ambiguous, no matter how technically sophisticated it is. He emphasises the danger of this as it encourages perverse effects, demonstrated by the deaths and extent of damage after the earthquake.
Frank Knight introduces the concept of uncertainty as being unmeasurable unknowns. In the case of L'Aquila, this refers to both the uncertainty surrounding when an earthquake might occur and uncertainty of how this would be communicated to the public. Bonita and Marchi argue that this epistemic uncertainty which led to misinformation being spread to the public. This is also highlighted in the communication models themselves, which were weak and ill-defined, leading to the government decision to omit the idea entirely, in fear of confusing and overwhelming the wider public. Precautionary measures could have been implemented for the public during the 4 months of seismic movement building up to the main earthquake. It therefore becomes clear that understanding the intrinsic unpredictability of events like earthquakes instead of solely relying on data is important when applying to societies like L'Aquila. It is clear from how these uncertainties within predictions and modelling were communicated to the public and the consequences of this that there were many lessons to be learnt from the L'Aquila earthquake. Most significantly, perhaps, it highlights the importance of establishing a collaboration between stakeholders and scientists, instead of solely relying upon scientific knowledge as completely and reliably deterministic.
Within decision-making, there is a process of co-production between knowledge bases and communities, both political, scientific and social. Carrying out this co-production is essential to decision-making, as the consequences can be severe without it, as witnessed at L'Aquila. Science and other decision-making bodies consist of widely different institutional frameworks containing different values of communication and knowledge with very different forms of legitimization. They can be conflicting, which is why collaboration is essential for holistic understanding. However, varying definitions of what is usable knowledge makes decision-making complex and can be overlooked by policymakers wanting to make quick choices. Disaster response management at L'Aquila was controlled using top-down methods, as governments made authoritative decisions and could control the population through avoiding causing widespread panic and hysteria amongst their population. More sustainable planning and collaboration could have prevented this miscommunication of false information which misinformed 26 citizens who consequently lost their lives and pushed the blame onto the scientists. The L'Aquila earthquake displays a lack of participation with the public, creating a lack of understanding of the social conditions and contexts which could have provided a more holistic insight into how the earthquake would affect the population and lead to more effective management.
Placing responsibility is society's way of understanding what has happened in the aftermath of a disaster. Shkler says that all responses to evil in the world can be divided into 2 categories. Either we accept a loss or infringement as a touch of ill faith,
or we approach it as an injustice that can be addressed, criticised and potentially sanctioned? In the case of the L'Aquila earthquake, it appears to be the latter. The earthquake was initially predicted by a scientist named Giuliani, who tried to warn the wider scientific community and the Department of Civil Protection and Government. He was responsible for sharing scientific knowledge about natural hazards, but his warnings were considered a form of unnecessary alarmism, and he was banned from publishing his work. In the earthquake aftermath, there were strong calls across Italian society to attribute blame and find those responsible for the mistakes made.
The main instance in which we see the politics of blame play out is during the trial of the L'Aquila 7. The final verdict was decided not on what the scientists could have known, but what the scientists did know, which was that there was a possible earthquake, and their choice to act as if they knew nothing about it. Although the focus of the disaster's aftermath was placed on the 7 scientists, they were not the only institution to be held responsible. The Department of Civil Protection had also dismissed Giuliani's prediction and took legal proceedings to ban his work. This, of course, is a large contributing factor as to why there was no warning beforehand to the people of L'Aquila. How do we then place responsibility on the scientists alone?
Eventually, in 2014, an appeals court overturned their 6-year prison sentences and the government official sentence was reduced to 2 years. Many members of the public were enraged that the results had been overturned, yet scientists around the world were relieved. Clearly, the politics of blame and responsibility of scientists are directly brought into question. As Alexander 2014 highlights, this trial was seen as an attempt on a national scale to bring morality back into public life and redefine the role of science in the management of hazards in Italy. This has led us to 4 key conclusions. Firstly, that models represent a tool to provide initial understanding. However, relying solely on scientific knowledge can oversimplify the severity of the situation and the resultant decision-making. Secondly, that uncertainty within knowledge and communication with the public heavily implicates the ability of the public to prepare for natural hazards. Thirdly, that the multifaceted communication between scientists, policy planners and the public should be more rigorously adopted into decision-making, encouraging better co-production of knowledge and outcomes. And finally, that responsibility can never be placed solely on a single individual or group. Instead, there are numerous interconnected agents that are responsible for disaster management.